So similarly with Facebook, where the government bodies are taking down people's comments willy-nilly, or they're taking them down for viewpoint perspectives. In other words, the negative comments about the government's activities are removed, but the positive comments are kept up. That's problematic from hugely problematic from a First Amendment perspective. But I'm not familiar with any other online engagement mechanism in Illinois. We don't do online voting, although there's some interest, I believe, in the legislature to pursue online voting. And in terms of participating with the government, that's pretty much it, Facebook, at this point in Illinois.
Yeah, I might just add, we run a blog out of the Institute called Gov 2.0 Watch, which is looking not just at some of the social network stuff, but this is a exploding world, the intersection of technology and governing institutions, and is not just about social networks. It's about specifically developed online engagement platforms. It's about open data and how that data is visualized. And so there are a lot of different elements within the field. And I think one of the challenges to governing institutions that are questioning how they're going to move forward in this is that most of the people presenting to governments options in online public engagement are selling their own platform. And I think it really behooves governing institutions to, in much the same way as you would ask of a face-to-face public process, what are we trying to get out of this, right? And try to connect the purpose to your process. You have to do that in the online space as well. And I think, there are a lot of great tools out there, and I have friends that are working in that field. But I think it is unfortunate that sometimes you have municipalities that just want to, let's just do an online platform that does X, without really thinking through, the reason you picked that was because the salesman came and told you that that was really the best tool. And so you really have to be evaluative of the platform you're going to build. And in the same way, ask many of the same questions as Matt was talking about before about outreach. Because there is also that element, I see this much more in the public sector than the private sector, that if we build it, they will come. And just slapping a MindMixer platform or user voice platform or Next 10 platform onto your municipality's website without really knowing what the traffic is to the website is really setting yourself up for failure. So thinking through the same kind of outreach diagnostic questions, how can we get people here, is essential to do as well.
Okay. Well, as far as there's couple different levels to this question. One is in terms of what's online tools you could use for good participation. One thing that you can take a look at is a guide that came out from the IBM Center for the Business of Government called Using Online Tools to Engage and Be Engaged by the Public. So that kind of lists all these different yeah. I wrote it, but not being a techie, I think it was actually good that somebody like me wrote it because I had to kind of learn about it from a non-techie's point of view, and hopefully it's stuff is explained there in a way that non-techies can deal with. So that's just, but now that came out last year, and as Pete was saying, I mean this stuff, the technology, as we all know, is changing so rapidly. And so there's things like GovLab, which is an NYU institute, which has kind of got all kinds of interesting things you can take a look at. There's a lot of stuff related to the Knight Foundation. If you take a look at anytime they run a Knight News Challenge, those kinds of things, you see all kinds of really cutting edge kinds of things that people are developing. Again, it's kind of like, you gotta have like Pete was saying, you gotta have a broader plan. Otherwise, all you've got is a bunch of gadgets, without any connection between them. So even if they're great gadgets, they need to be part of some kind of bigger thinking about what kind of engagement picture do we want in our community, face-to-face, online, different kinds of face-to-face, neighborhood associations, whatever, and kind of fit those kinds of things. The other aspect of the question, I mean, I don't know that there's really an answer yet, which is partly why we're doing this legal framework, because nobody knows in most places what is legal as far as using Facebook, or whether city council members can tweet, or whether all this kind of stuff is it's open to interpretation, and so that's it's the kind of thing that you almost have to kind of either grit your teeth and jump into it, or do some of this kind of initial thinking about what ought to do. One thing I want to say, which is kind of related to this, is I think that it would be unfortunate if this whole conversation ended up in kind of a false debate between transparency and more intensive forms of participation, because you can have both, and some of the kind of when I think about one of the main reasons we want to have transparency is to prevent corruption, prevent backroom dealing, these kinds of things that people need to know about. And I think then also about the developing world, which I really shouldn't even call the developing world, because lots of it is a lot more developed than we suspect or we think here. And in particular, when it comes to their democracies, their systems for public participation, in places like Brazil and India, they're probably a lot more developed than what we've got. So it's not there. Maybe I should say the global South. But in many of those countries, corruption and the need for transparency has been a big issue. And the way in which, a very effective way in which they have dealt with it, is not just by creating better transparency, but by creating better participation. That is an underappreciated tool for kind of some of the same goals, and sympathetic with some of the same kind of practices that you'd want to do under the banner of transparency.
So the question is for mid-level and upper government public sector officials that believe they are doing an effective job, either through posting certain things online, that they're doing effective public engagement, but they're really not addressing some of the more hot button or proximate front burner issues that are really of importance to the community. There's a little bit of a self-selection bias in the people that I work with, because they're saying we've put out a banner that says, or an emailer that says that we're leading a training seminar in how to do more effective public engagement, and they're showing up to it. So they're applying for a grant, or they're calling up saying that we need some help on this local issue. So one of the things we do, though, and I co-facilitate the training with a couple different people. One happens to be a longtime city manager, recently retired from the Bay Area, a guy by the name of Ed Everett, who is, let's just say, not sparing in his words to fellow and current government officials about really calling them on the carpet to say, what you're doing is just not good enough. And I think, unfortunately or fortunately, that human behavior often changes only under significant duress. And I believe that Newton's law of thermodynamics is really applicable to human nature, that an object in motion will remain in motion unless approached by an outside force, right? And so most of the people that we work with, they come to us after they've done something that they've called public engagement but really wasn't, and it really fell apart. The Humboldt Bay project, for example, in Northern California, they came to us after they had tried to make this decision with doing a series of public comment-based meetings, made this decision in what got perceived to be, and probably was, a top-down way, and really the whole process fell apart. And it took 5 years for that community with new leadership to come back to a place where they say, okay, we have to make this decision. Let's see if we can do this in a different way. So unfortunately, most of the people, the public sector officials who are coming to these new understandings are only doing it because they've either had a very bad experience around doing public comment and trying to make a decision that way, or it is something where they know, and this is usually around budgets, they know that the decisions that they will have to make are going to be so deleterious and so controversial that, and I mentioned this yesterday in some comments in another place, that they will say to me, Pete, I need to get cover from the public in making this decision. Now, that is not necessarily a bad place to start. And I've been a part of many projects in which that is the beginning, that realization on the part of a public sector official can be the beginning of a really great public process, but it can also be the beginning of a really bad one, in which they've really made that decision already, whether it's about the budget issue or the land use issue. I would also say, though, and this is something that I think is changing, I've gotten to know Jonathan Reichenthal, who is the Chief Information Officer for the city of Palo Alto, which, as you may know, is the home of Stanford and is regarded by many to be the capital of Silicon Valley. And it's a rather anomalous community, right? I think the number of PhDs there is, I don't know, it's over 50% probably. I mean, it's just amazing. And with Silicon Valley, there's a big emphasis on technology. But what he says is that we're being dragged into using technology in a much more engaging way of a public. So if you go to the City of Palo Alto's website and you click on their open budget platform, you will see a municipal budget presented in a way that you probably will have never seen before. And that is not only a civic education experience in learning how your city is spending its money, but you can actually, it's open data, so you can download that information as well. Now, they're, to me, what I would call a first adopter in this area of using technology to engage the public. And I think it's going to be, you know, we're not going to see maybe a lot of municipalities doing what Palo Alto is doing for different cultural reasons that are present there. But I think that's where everything is heading. And I think over time that a lot of this, as I know Matt can agree to, a lot of this has been a progression. You could call it a movement. I would call it just this changing relationship between governments and municipalities. And unless and until that municipal official is either retired or the pressure because of that issue is so great that they say, you know, the typical town meeting just isn't going to get us, you know, the responses or solutions that are sustainable. It's going to be very difficult for change in behavior.
Yeah, I mean, an increasing number of them, wouldn't you say? I mean, see a bigger picture. I mean, you know, and it's driven. I mean, the latest thing which is really driving it is the thing we mentioned, or you mentioned earlier, is the bottom line. You know, the kind of the number of city governments, school systems, other kinds of public institutions which are in financial crisis, is driving people, you know, to think more about this kind of stuff than ever before. And it takes, as you were saying also, with giving the example of Ed Everett, it takes often public officials to tell other public officials, you know, look, we got to wake up here. I was in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, where Charlotte is, and I was giving this presentation to county department heads and showing all my nice little slides about public engagement, and they were all nodding politely and, you know, asking nice little questions, and I could tell they didn't really get, you know, they weren't bought into this. And then Harry Jones, the county executive, got up and said, if you people think that we're going to get through this recession and things are going to go back to the way they were, you got another thing coming, that unless we reframe our relationship with those people out there whom we serve and who are our ultimate source of money, we are not going to survive. And I think an increasing number of public officials understand that basic relationship between the money and the relationship. Money and the kind of how they interact with citizens. And that's, but it takes not just people like me or Pete saying this, but it takes often public officials, retired or current, to do it. The other piece is, and I think it shows up in that little story, is the need to think about this in terms of the way these institutions are structured. And that most public, like most institutions, the public-facing elements are at the very top and the very bottom. You know, school teachers interact with parents, cops interact with people on streets, police chiefs and school superintendents, you know, and other kinds of institutions. It's part of their job to interact with the community. In between, there's a whole lot of people who are making all kinds of really critical decisions about what's happening and how policies are implemented, what policies are, who are not interacting with the public in any kind of way. And so some of the best public engagement efforts, like I remember one that was early on, that really forced me to see this in Buffalo, where a police department was doing a big kind of community crime prevention kind of deliberative process, and it was really successful because they got the police lieutenants and the inspectors. The middle level people were heavily bought in. They were the ones also meeting in small groups with residents, not just the beat cops and the chief. So that's and then a couple of years after that, I remember talking to this guy who's an assistant city manager in San Jose. He's now a city manager of another city in California. And he was the one who had started this thing called the Strong Neighborhoods Initiative in San Jose, which is really, for a long time, was a really good example, long-running example of a kind of a sustained neighborhood-level engagement effort and structure where the city and the neighborhood residents working together all the time. And he said that when they first started doing it, they thought it was kind of an external thing, a PR thing. Here's how we kind of have a better line of communication with residents in San Jose neighborhoods. And they said pretty early on we realized if we were going to do this well at all, we had to restructure how City Hall worked. And we had to have kind of break down some of the silos between departments and have kind of create these cross-departmental teams that were assigned to neighborhoods. They did all kinds of things within the structure of the organization that were necessary to make them able to do public participation well. And so I think part of this larger picture we're dealing with is very big picture. We have citizens now who have different capacities and different expectations than they did 20 years ago. They're a new set of people out there. And when I say citizens, I mean with a small c, not legal, I mean people. And we have institutions which are 100 years old, which are based on a 1910 model, capital P progressive model of expert-oriented bureaucracies. And the two of those two forces are, that's what is causing a whole lot of the tension and frustration and pain that we're dealing with, and inefficiency and declining trust in government. But it's also the opportunity where we can figure out how do we kind of recalibrate those institutions and create settings in which these new people with these new interests, capacities, and expectations can interact meaningfully with people within the institutions. That's got a whole lot of potential that we're seeing.
I have a question for Matt before he has to leave, which is, what would you suggest for us? Where should we start? And then you can pass it to Pete and down the line.
Well, I think, and I've talked a lot about it, I think the question of what kind of, that's the fundamental question. What kind of engagement picture do we want? And it's a question you can ask at the neighborhood level and do pilot projects or work in your neighborhood, or if you're at a city level, working pilot neighborhoods, or you can be thinking about it at a city level. It's what are those different kinds of opportunities that people will like, and that one other piece of that's important is coming up with some way of tracking what people like that allows them to help measure engagement, to help track engagement, to make comments and suggestions about how engagement itself can be improved. That's one kind of frontier in technology we're not taking advantage of yet, but there's a whole lot of online systems out there that allow people to report problems, to gather data about things like potholes or graffiti. That's a huge deal now. We need to use that same kind of thinking and that same kind of technology to help people measure, track, and improve engagement itself.
I